Remove her. Now. The gavel cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot, sharp and final, echoing against polished wood and cold marble as every head turned in the same direction at once, drawn not by chaos but by authority, by the weight of a voice that had never needed to repeat itself. Judge Richard Caldwell sat high above them all, his robe perfectly still, his expression carved from something harder than stone, his pale blue eyes fixed on the woman standing near the defense table like she had stepped out of place in a world that had no space for her. Ava Williams didn't move at first, her fingers still resting on the edge of a worn legal folder, the fluorescent lights overhead humming softly, as if the room itself was holding its breath. A bailiff shifted beside her, hesitant for half a second too long before stepping forward. "Ma'am, you need to come with me," he said quietly, but the words felt louder than the judge's order, heavier, because they carried finality, dismissal, erasure. Ava's chest rose slowly, one measured breath, then another. Her eyes flicked once toward the bench, not defiant, not pleading, just steady, like she was trying to anchor something that was already slipping away. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, colder. "This court will not tolerate interruptions from unauthorized individuals," each word deliberate, controlled, practiced over decades of command. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances, subtle, almost invisible, but enough. A ripple of quiet judgment, of assumption, of labels already forming without facts. Ava's shoes pressed softly against the polished floor as she shifted her weight, the faint squeak breaking the silence in a way that felt too loud, too exposed. She tightened her grip on the folder, the edges creasing under her fingers, inside it pages of notes, margins filled with careful handwriting, observations no one had asked for, connections no one had noticed, and somewhere buried in those lines, a truth that didn't care about rank or robes or titles. "I'm not trying to disrupt," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm, like she had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times and still knew it would never go the way it needed to. Caldwell's jaw tightened just enough to be seen by those close enough to notice, but not enough to break the image he had built over years. "You already have," he replied, cutting her off before the sentence could breathe. The gavel rested in his hand, not raised, not needed, because the power was already spoken, already enforced. The bailiff stepped closer now, a gentle but firm presence at her side, guiding rather than forcing, because force wasn't necessary when the system itself did the work. Ava's gaze dropped for a brief second, not in submission, but in calculation, in restraint, her thumb brushing the edge of a page where a single line had been underlined twice, a detail that didn't belong, a number that didn't align, a timestamp that felt wrong, the kind of thing most people would skim past, the kind of thing that could decide everything. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, thicker, like something unseen had shifted just beneath the surface. Caldwell straightened back in his chair, already moving on, already reclaiming control of the room. "Proceed," he said to the attorneys as if nothing had happened, as if the interruption had been nothing more than background noise, as if the woman being led toward the door had never mattered. But just before Ava reached the threshold, she paused, not enough to resist, just enough to turn her head slightly, her voice barely above a breath, steady despite everything. "That evidence is fabricated." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed quietly, precisely, like something placed exactly where it was meant to be, and for a fraction of a second, too small for most to notice, Judge Caldwell's hand stilled on the bench, the faint hum of the lights suddenly louder than anything else in the room. The courtroom doors closed behind Ava with a muted thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the sound carried something unfinished with it. The hallway outside stretched wide and sterile under rows of fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to make the air feel unsteady. A quiet hum settling into the bones, the kind of government building silence that was never truly silent, just layered with distant footsteps, low voices, and the faint buzz of machinery hidden behind walls. The bailiff released his hold gently once they were clear of the doorway, stepping back as if his role had ended the moment she crossed that threshold. "You cannot interrupt like that," he said. Not unkind, just procedural, as though repeating something he had been trained to say without ever questioning why. Ava nodded once, her shoulders still squared, her breathing controlled but shallow. The folder still pressed against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in a space that had just pushed her out. She did not argue, did not explain, because she knew how it sounded, a woman without credentials, without standing, speaking against a case that had already been shaped, decided. Moving forward like a train that no one intended to stop, the polished tile floor reflected the overhead lights in broken lines beneath her feet as she walked slowly toward a row of metal benches along the wall. Each step measured, deliberate, like she was holding herself together piece by piece. She sat down carefully, placing the folder on her lap, her fingers lingering on the cover before sliding it open again. The pages inside rustled softly, a quiet contrast to the rigid authority she had just left behind. Her eyes scanned the same lines she had read over and over. Dates, signatures, cross-references, all clean on the surface, all accepted without question, except for that one section, that one inconsistency that did not belong, a timestamp that shifted by exactly 3 minutes in a sequence where precision was everything. It was small, almost invisible, but it bent the timeline just enough to change everything if someone chose to see it. She traced the line again with her finger, slower this time, as if repetition might make it louder, more undeniable. But the hallway did not respond. No one stopped, no one asked. People passed by in suits, carrying files, talking about schedules and deadlines, their voices blending into a low, constant current that never reached her. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, not defeat, just weight, the kind that settled quietly and stayed. At the far end of the hallway, a large window let in a thin stream of daylight, pale and distant, cutting across the floor in a narrow strip that did not quite reach where she sat. She watched it for a moment, the dust particles drifting through the beam, suspended, moving without direction, and for a second everything slowed, her thoughts, the noise, the pressure of what she knew and what she could not yet prove. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to steady, to hold on to the one thing that had not shifted, the truth itself, not loud, not dramatic, just there, waiting. Back inside the courtroom, the murmur of proceedings resumed, muffled now through the heavy doors, voices rising and falling in controlled cadence, decisions being shaped without her. Without the missing piece she carried, Ava opened her eyes again, her grip on the folder tightening slightly, not out of fear, but resolve. She had been dismissed, overlooked, labeled before she could be heard. But the detail did not disappear just because she had been removed. It remained, exact, patient, and somewhere beyond those doors, whether they realized it yet or not. Everything still depended on it. Inside the courtroom, the air had settled back into its rigid rhythm, voices measured, controlled, each word placed carefully on the record as if precision alone could guarantee truth. Judge Richard Caldwell sat upright behind the bench, his posture unchanged, his expression once again composed into the same calm authority that had defined his reputation for years. Yet something beneath that surface had shifted, small but undeniable, like a thread pulled loose in a tightly woven fabric. The prosecutor continued speaking, outlining the timeline of events with confidence, each point reinforced by documents projected onto the large screen to the side, timestamps, location data, statements, all aligned in a sequence that appeared seamless to anyone not looking closer. Caldwell's eyes followed the presentation, steady, analytical, but when the timestamp appeared again, that same section Ava had pointed to, his gaze lingered half a second longer than before, just enough for the detail to return, not as a challenge, but as a question. The number sat there, unchanged, accepted, yet now it carried weight it had not carried minutes earlier. He shifted slightly in his chair, the faint creak of leather almost lost beneath the low hum of the courtroom. His fingers resting against the edge of the bench tapped once, subtle, controlled, a habit he rarely allowed himself in public. The defense attorney rose to respond, reinforcing the narrative already in motion, emphasizing consistency, reliability, the strength of the presented evidence. And the room responded as it always did, with quiet agreement, nods, notes taken, assumptions reinforced. But Caldwell did not nod this time. His attention had narrowed, focusing not on the argument itself, but on the structure beneath it. the framework that held it together. Because if one point shifted, even slightly, the entire sequence could fracture. He leaned forward a fraction, his voice cutting in, calm but deliberate. "Counselor, clarify the timestamp on Exhibit 12. The interruption was unexpected. Brief confusion flickered across the attorney's face before it was quickly masked with professionalism. "It reflects the recorded time of the incident, Your Honor." The answer came smoothly. Rehearsed, but Caldwell did not look satisfied. "And the source of that timestamp?" He pressed, not raising his voice, but tightening the focus. The attorney hesitated this time. Just for a moment, long enough to be noticed. "It was extracted from the original system logs," he replied, and now the room felt different, the quiet no longer passive, but attentive, watching, waiting. Caldwell's gaze shifted to the screen again. The number unchanged, yet now it seemed less stable, less certain, like something that had been assumed correct simply because no one had questioned it. His mind moved quickly, retracing the sequence, aligning each piece, measuring consistency. And there it was again, that slight misalignment, 3 minutes, small enough to ignore, significant enough to matter. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in recognition. He reached for the file in front of him. Flipping to the corresponding section, the pages crisp, organized, authoritative, yet now carrying a flaw that had been invisible until it was named, and it had been named by someone he had already dismissed, outside the courtroom. Ava remained seated on the metal bench, unaware of the shift beginning to take shape beyond the doors, her fingers resting lightly on the open folder, her eyes no longer scanning but waiting, because she knew what the detail meant. She knew what would happen if someone inside chose to see it. The hallway light had shifted slightly as the sun moved higher, the thin beam stretching just a little farther across the floor, inching closer to where she sat. And in that quiet, suspended moment, two separate spaces held the same truth, one beginning to question it, the other already certain, and between them, only a door stood closed, for now. The courtroom no longer moved with the same certainty it had just minutes earlier. The rhythm had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a metronome falling out of sync. Judge Caldwell sat still, but his focus had narrowed into something sharper, more deliberate, his eyes moving between the projected evidence and the documents spread before him, each line no longer accepted but examined, weighed, questioned. The prosecutor continued speaking, but the confidence in his tone now carried a slight edge, as if he could feel the shift without fully understanding it. "Your Honor, the timeline has been verified through multiple channels," he insisted, his voice steady but just a fraction tighter. Caldwell did not respond immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make the room aware of it. His fingers pressed lightly against the page where the timestamp sat, unchanged, unchallenged until now, and yet no longer invisible. "Multiple channels can repeat the same error," Caldwell said finally, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a precision that cut deeper than volume ever could. A faint murmur moved through the gallery, quickly suppressed. The defense attorney leaned forward, seizing the moment. "Your Honor, if there is any discrepancy, we request a pause to review the integrity of the evidence." Caldwell's gaze lifted slightly, not toward the attorney, but toward the screen again. The number still there, still simple, still ordinary, except now it carried consequence. He could feel it, not as emotion, but as calculation, as the weight of a decision forming before it was spoken. He had built a career on certainty, on control, on the ability to move through cases without hesitation, and yet now hesitation had found its place, small, unwelcome, but necessary. "Bring me the original log extraction," he said, his tone leaving no room for delay. A clerk moved quickly, retrieving a separate file, the quiet shuffle of paper suddenly louder than before, each movement observed, each second stretching just slightly longer. Caldwell took the document, flipping through it with practiced efficiency. But his eyes did not skim, they locked onto each entry, aligning times, cross-checking sequences. And there it was again, the same misalignment, 3 minutes that did not belong, 3 minutes that disrupted the structure everything else depended on. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition of something deeper, something more dangerous than a simple mistake. Because mistakes could be corrected, but patterns suggested intention. His mind moved quickly, connecting implications. If the timestamp was altered, then the sequence was unreliable, and if the sequence was unreliable, then the conclusion built on it could not stand. The room waited, silent now, no longer passive, but alert, sensing the shift in authority, sensing that something was no longer aligned. Caldwell leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking softly, his gaze drifting for just a fraction of a second toward the closed courtroom doors, an image forming uninvited, a woman standing with a worn folder, her voice steady despite dismissal. That evidence is fabricated. The words echoed again, not loud, but persistent. He had dismissed her. Without review, without pause, because she did not fit the structure he trusted, and now that structure was beginning to fracture. Outside in the hallway, Ava remained seated, the light from the window now reaching the edge of her shoes, a thin line of warmth against the cool tile. She had not moved, not because she was waiting for permission, but because she understood something the room inside was only beginning to realize. Truth did not depend on authority to exist, it only required someone willing to see it. Back inside, Caldwell closed the file slowly, the sound soft but final, his decision not yet spoken, but already forming, and for the first time since the session began, the authority in the room did not feel absolute. It felt conditional, balanced on something fragile, something that had been overlooked and now could not be ignored. The silence in the courtroom no longer felt neutral. It pressed in from every direction, thick and watchful, as if the room itself had become aware that something had gone wrong. Judge Caldwell remained seated, but the authority that once radiated from him now carried a different weight, not diminished, but challenged by something quieter and far more dangerous, uncertainty. His eyes moved once more across the documents, not searching now, but confirming, locking each inconsistency into place. The 3-minute gap no longer a possibility but a fracture, one that could not be dismissed without consequence. He placed the file down with deliberate care, aligning it with the edge of the bench as though restoring order in small, controlled ways. "Counsel," he said, his voice steady but lower than before. "Approach." The attorneys moved forward, their steps measured but noticeably slower. The confidence that had filled the room earlier now replaced with caution, anticipation. Caldwell leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on them. "This timeline does not reconcile," he stated, not as a question, but as a conclusion. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, the pause brief yet telling. "Your Honor, the data was verified through official channels," he repeated, but the words sounded thinner now, less certain under scrutiny. Caldwell did not raise his voice, did not show frustration, but the precision in his tone sharpened. "Verification does not eliminate the possibility of manipulation," he replied, the word lingering in the air longer than anything spoken before. Manipulation. It shifted the room entirely, a quiet ripple moving through the gallery, subtle glances exchanged. The defense attorney straightened slightly, sensing the shift in balance. "Your Honor, if the integrity of the evidence is compromised, then the entire case requires immediate review." Caldwell did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting once again, not to the attorneys, not to the evidence, but toward the closed doors behind them, as if the answer was no longer contained within. The room itself, the image returned again, uninvited but undeniable, a woman standing firm despite dismissal, her voice steady, not emotional, not desperate, just certain. He had heard countless arguments in this courtroom, loud ones, polished ones, strategic ones, but hers had been different, not crafted for persuasion, not shaped for approval. It had been simple, direct, and now increasingly difficult to ignore. Outside, Ava remained seated on the metal bench, the hallway quieter now as foot. Traffic slowed, the light from the window stretching farther, warming the edge of the floor near her feet. She had not reopened the folder, not because there was nothing left to see, but because she had already seen enough. Her hands rested still, her posture composed. Yet beneath that stillness was tension, not fear, but the weight of knowing what was at stake. Inside, Caldwell exhaled slowly, a controlled release of breath that did not break his composure but marked a shift within it. He turned back to the attorneys, his decision forming with clarity that did not rely on confidence, but on necessity. This court cannot proceed on evidence that fails internal consistency, he said, each word measured, final. I am ordering an immediate review of all submitted data. The statement landed firmly, altering the direction of the case in an instant. The prosecutor's expression tightened. The defense attorney lowered his gaze briefly in acknowledgement, but Caldwell was already moving past them, his attention shifting beyond the current argument, beyond the immediate correction, towards something more pressing, something he had overlooked. He reached for the gavel but did not strike it immediately, his hand hovering for just a moment, as if weighing more than the decision itself. Then, with a single controlled motion, he brought it down, the sound sharp but contained. Recess, he announced. The room stirred, voices rising softly as people stood, papers gathered, movement returning in cautious waves, but Caldwell remained seated for a fraction longer than necessary, his gaze fixed once more on the doors, no longer just aware of what lay beyond them, but understanding that whatever came next would require him to step outside the authority he had relied on and face the one person he had already dismissed, not as a judge, but as someone who might now need to listen. The courtroom had emptied into a low hum of distant voices and shuffling footsteps, but the hallway outside remained suspended in a quieter kind of stillness, the kind that stretched time without breaking it. Ava Williams sat exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly on the closed folder in her lap, as if holding it too tightly might disturb something fragile inside it. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale, even glow across the corridor, flattening everything into shades of gray and soft reflections. The metal bench beneath her carried a faint chill that had long since settled into her body. Yet she did not shift, did not fidget, her breathing slow, measured, almost in rhythm with the distant echo of doors opening and closing somewhere deeper in the building. The beam of sunlight from the far window had stretched farther now, reaching across the floor until it brushed the edge of her shoes, a thin line of warmth that contrasted with the sterile air around her. She lowered her gaze to it briefly, watching how the light moved without effort, without permission, touching surfaces that never asked for it. And for a moment her expression softened, not with relief, but with understanding. Inside the courtroom, decisions had paused, authority had stepped back. But here, in this quiet space, nothing demanded anything from her, nothing judged, nothing interrupted. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction, the tension not gone, but redistributed into something steadier, something she could carry. Footsteps approached from the far end of the hallway, measured, deliberate, not hurried, but not aimless either, the sound distinct against the polished floor, each step echoing just enough to announce its presence without urgency. Ava did not look up immediately, not out of indifference, but because she had learned the rhythm of this place, learned that most footsteps passed without stopping. Most people moved around her, not toward her. She remained still, her attention returning to the quiet weight of the folder in her hands. The pages inside unmoving, yet filled with something that had already begun to shift the course of events beyond those closed doors. The footsteps grew closer, slowing as they approached, then stopping a few feet away. The air seemed to tighten slightly, not with pressure, but with awareness. Ava lifted her eyes then, calm, steady, meeting the presence in front of her without surprise. Judge Caldwell stood there. No bench, no elevation, no barrier between them. His robe still perfectly arranged, yet somehow less imposing in the open space of the hallway. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in everything that had already happened. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence different now, not empty, but filled with recognition. Caldwell's gaze rested on her, not with the detached authority of before, but with something more focused, more searching, as if recalibrating what he thought he understood. His hands were at his sides, still, controlled, yet no longer signaling command. The hallway light reflected faintly in his eyes, softening the edges of a presence that had once felt absolute. Ava held his gaze without shifting, without lowering her eyes, not in defiance, but in clarity. She did not need to prove anything in this moment. The truth she carried did not change based on who stood in front of her. Caldwell inhaled quietly, a breath that seemed more deliberate than necessary, then spoke, his voice lower than it had been inside the courtroom. Stripped of projection. That discrepancy you mentioned, he said, each word precise but no longer dismissive. Explain it. There was no command in the request, no dismissal either, just a space opened, narrow but real. Ava glanced down at the folder, her fingers brushing the edge before opening it slowly, the pages shifting softly in the still air. She turned to the marked section, the underlined line that had not changed since she first saw it, then lifted the folder slightly, angling it so he could see. The timestamp shifts by 3 minutes between the system log and the recorded sequence, she said, her voice even, controlled. That gap should not exist if the data was captured continuously. Caldwell's eyes followed the line she indicated, his focus sharpening, not scanning, but absorbing, the detail no longer abstract, but anchored, real. He did not interrupt, did not challenge immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, narrowing the distance just enough to see clearly, to confirm for himself. And in that small movement, something unspoken shifted again, not power, not control, but perspective. The hallway remained quiet around them, the light steady, the air unchanged. Yet within that stillness, the balance between them had begun to move, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Judge Caldwell did not move away from the page immediately, his eyes fixed on the exact line Ava had indicated, the numbers sitting there with deceptive simplicity, ordinary at first glance, yet now carrying a weight that pressed deeper the longer he looked. The hallway seemed to narrow around that single point of focus, the fluorescent light above casting a faint reflection across the paper, making the ink appear almost sharper, more deliberate. His mind moved quickly, reconstructing the timeline not as it had been presented in court, but as it would exist if this inconsistency held true. 3 minutes. Not an error of rounding, not a delay in transmission, but a clean break in continuity, a gap that suggested intervention. His jaw tightened slightly as the implications aligned. If the sequence had been altered, then the narrative built around it was no longer reliable. And if the narrative was compromised, then the verdict he had been prepared to deliver would not have been justice. It would have been assumption. He straightened slowly, the paper still in view, but no longer needing to be held closer. The realization settling into place with a clarity that did not allow retreat. Ava remained still, watching him, not with expectation, but with quiet certainty. She had already followed this path, already reached this conclusion long before he had stepped into the hallway. For her, this was not discovery. It was confirmation. Caldwell exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. His gaze lifted from the page to her face, studying her not as an interruption, not as an outsider, but as the one person who had seen what everyone else had missed. Why did no one else catch this? He asked, the question not accusatory, but searching. Ava did not hesitate, her voice calm, grounded. Because they trusted the system more than the data, she replied, her words simple, but they settled into the space between them with a weight that did not need elaboration. Caldwell's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show the impact of that truth. He had built his career on that same trust, on the belief that structure ensured accuracy, that process eliminated error, and yet here it was, a flaw that had moved through every checkpoint unquestioned until someone outside that structure had spoken. His gaze dropped briefly back to the page, then beyond it, as if seeing not just this case, but the pattern it represented, the quiet vulnerability within systems designed to appear flawless. Footsteps passed at the far end of the hallway, distant, irrelevant, the world continuing around them while something more significant settled into place here. Caldwell closed the folder gently, handing it back to Ava with a motion that carried no authority, only acknowledgement. His fingers released the edge without hesitation, a small gesture, but one that marked a shift he could not reverse. If this is correct, he said, his voice lower now, more measured than ever, then the case inside that courtroom is built on a compromised foundation. Ava nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition. Yes, she said quietly. Caldwell held her gaze for a moment longer, the silence stretching not with tension, but with the weight of what came next, because this was no longer about identifying the flaw, it was about confronting its consequences. his mind moved ahead, already calculating the procedural impact, the ethical obligation, the public implications, but beneath all of that was something more immediate, more personal, the realization that he had dismissed the one person who could have prevented all of it before it began. He turned slightly, his body angling back toward the courtroom doors, but he did not take a step yet, as if the distance between decision and action required one final moment of clarity. When he spoke again, his voice carried something it had not carried before, not authority, not certainty, but humility, quiet and restrained. "I need you to walk me through everything," he said, not as a command, but as a request. Ava looked at him for a brief second, then down at the folder in her hands, the pages that had been overlooked now holding more weight than anything presented inside the courtroom. She closed it carefully, her fingers steady, then stood, the movement simple, unforced. And as she did, the balance between them shifted fully, not through confrontation, not through force, but through truth finally being seen. And for the first time since the case had begun, the path forward no longer belonged to the system alone. It belonged to the one who had the courage to question it. They walked back toward the courtroom side by side, but not as equals of status. Not yet. The difference now was quieter, more precise. It lived in the space between their steps, in the way Judge Caldwell no longer moved ahead, but slightly slowed, allowing Ava to guide the pace without announcing it. The hallway seemed longer on the return, the light from the window now stretching fully across the floor behind them. Fading gradually as they approached the heavy doors, Ava held the folder close. Her fingers firm but steady, not protective, just certain, as if every page inside had already proven its place. Caldwell glanced once toward her hands, then forward again, his expression composed but no longer closed. When they reached the doors, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the handle, the cool metal grounding. He had stepped through these doors thousands of times, always with certainty, always with control. But this time the pause lingered, not out of hesitation, but awareness. He pushed the door open and the courtroom sound returned immediately. Voices, movement, the low shuffle of anticipation as people turned, noticing their re-entry. The room stilled again in stages, first the gallery, then the attorneys, then the clerk, until finally all attention returned to the bench. But Caldwell did not go directly to his seat. Instead, he remained standing just inside, his presence shifting the room without force. Ava stepped in beside him, her posture straight, her expression calm. But the contrast was unmistakable. Moments ago, she had been removed from this space. Now she stood within it again, not hidden, not silent. The attorneys exchanged quick glances, confusion flickering beneath professional composure. The prosecutor adjusted his stance, preparing to reassert control, but Caldwell raised a hand slightly, not sharply, just enough to hold the moment in place. "We are not proceeding as scheduled," he said, his voice clear, steady, but carrying a different tone now, less about control, more about correction. The room quieted completely, the weight of his words settling in. He turned slightly toward Ava, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without making it spectacle. "New information has been presented regarding the integrity of the timeline," he continued, each word measured, deliberate. "This court will review that information before any further action is taken." The prosecutor stepped forward, unable to remain silent. "Your Honor, with respect, the evidence has already been verified." His voice controlled, but tension edged through it. Caldwell did not raise his voice in response, but the firmness in his tone sharpened. "And yet it has not been questioned," he replied, the distinction landing with quiet force. He turned fully now, facing Ava, the shift visible to everyone in the room, authority acknowledging truth rather than dismissing it. "Miss Williams will present her findings," he said, the statement simple, but its impact immediate. A ripple moved through the gallery, subtle but undeniable. Ava did not react outwardly. She stepped forward one pace, then another, until she stood near the center, where all eyes could see her, the same place she had been pushed away from earlier, the same space that had once rejected her presence, now holding it. Her fingers opened the folder with a soft, controlled motion, the pages shifting under the courtroom lights. Her eyes moved across them briefly, not searching, just aligning her thoughts with what she already knew. When she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, not raised, but it carried. The timeline presented contains a 3-minute inconsistency between the system log and the recorded sequence, she said, her tone calm, precise. If the data were continuous, that gap would not exist. The room remained silent, not dismissive this time, but listening. The difference was subtle but absolute. She turned the page slightly, angling it toward the bench, but her focus did not leave the explanation. That inconsistency suggests the data was altered or interrupted. She continued, not dramatic, not accusatory, just factual. Caldwell watched her closely, not as a judge evaluating testimony, but as someone recognizing the structure of truth being rebuilt in front of him. The prosecutor's posture tightened. The defense attorney leaned forward slightly, the balance in the room shifting again, but now it was visible, measurable, undeniable. Ava finished speaking without flourish, without emphasis, simply allowing the detail to stand on its own. She lowered the page slightly, her hand steady. The silence that followed deeper than before, not empty, but filled with recognition. Caldwell stepped back toward the bench then, his movement deliberate, controlled, but different from before, not reclaiming power, but repositioning it. He sat, his gaze moving once across the room, then settling forward, the authority in his posture unchanged, but the meaning behind it transformed. The court acknowledges this discrepancy, he said, his voice firm, carrying through the room with clarity, and will proceed accordingly. The words did not close the moment, they opened it, and in that opening, the structure of the case shifted fully, no longer built on assumption, but on the truth that had been overlooked until now. The courtroom did not return to its previous rhythm. It settled into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every movement now carried awareness of what had nearly been overlooked. Judge Caldwell sat still behind the bench, his posture composed but no longer distant, his gaze resting on the documents before him with a focus that no longer assumed correctness, but demanded it. The attorneys remained in place, their earlier confidence reshaped into caution. The gallery watched in silence, not out of routine, but out of recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Ava stood where she had presented her findings, the folder now closed in her hands, her shoulders relaxed, not from relief, but from completion. She had said what needed to be said, nothing more, nothing less. The weight of the moment no longer resting on her alone. Caldwell reached for the documents again, flipping to the section that had altered everything, his fingers pausing briefly on the page, not out of doubt, but as a final acknowledgement of how easily it had been dismissed. He lifted his gaze slowly, scanning the room, not as a figure above it, but as someone accountable within it. The integrity of this case has been compromised, he said, his voice steady, carrying clearly through the courtroom, each word measured, deliberate. This court cannot proceed under those conditions. The statement settled heavily, not dramatic, but final in its clarity. The prosecutor lowered his gaze. The defense attorney remained still, absorbing the shift. No one spoke, because there was nothing to argue against. The flaw had been seen, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Caldwell leaned back slightly, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him, his hand resting near the gavel, but he did not reach for it yet. The pause stretched, not uncomfortably, but meaningfully, as if allowing the truth to fully take its place in the room. Then, with a controlled motion, he brought the gavel down once, the sound firm, contained, echoing just enough to mark the moment without overwhelming it. This session is adjourned pending full review, he said, the words closing the proceeding, but not the impact. Movement returned slowly, chairs shifting, papers gathered, voices rising in low, careful tones, but something remained in the air, something quieter than sound, yet more lasting. Ava stepped back from the center, not drawing attention, not seeking acknowledgement, simply moving with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. As she turned toward the aisle, the light from the high windows caught briefly on the edge of the folder in her hands, a soft reflection that moved with her, then faded as she continued forward. Caldwell watched her for a moment, not openly, but long enough to register what had changed, not just in the case, but in himself. He had not been overturned. not challenged in the way he expected conflict to appear. He had been corrected, quietly, precisely, by someone he had not considered worth hearing, and that realization did not demand words. It demanded memory. Ava reached the doors and pushed them open. The hallway beyond waiting in the same quiet stillness it had held before. She stepped through without hesitation, the sound of the courtroom fading behind her, replaced once again by the low hum of the building, the fluorescent lights, the distant footsteps, the ordinary rhythm of a place where most things passed unnoticed. She walked past the metal bench without stopping this time, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, but the space around her felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The truth she carried had been seen, not by force, not by insistence, but by remaining steady when it would have been easier to step back. Behind her, the courtroom doors closed slowly, the sound soft, final, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to settle. The light in the hallway stretching quietly across the floor, the air still, the building breathing in its usual rhythm, and within that silence, something remained, not spoken, not written, but understood, that authority without awareness can falter, but truth, when held with quiet certainty, has a way of finding its place, even in rooms that were never built to hear it.